Hey everybody, welcome back to the Unstoppable podcast. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and I'm here today with our guest, Matt Stephenson. Matt is an OG in the NFT space. He is working on his PhD in behavioral economics at Columbia, and he just sold his very first, not just his, but the very first science NFT ever through his company Planck for $24,000. There's so much more I can say about Matt, but that's just a very brief introduction. I'll bring him on and let him tell you a little bit more about himself. So welcome, Matt. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Diane. It's an honor to be here. I appreciate it.
Of course. So, before we dive into all of the things that you've done, why don't you take us all the way back to when you first heard about crypto? What was it about crypto that caught your attention initially? And how did you start learning about it?
Yes, it starts really early for me, actually. It was some comment on a blog that introduced me to Bitcoin back when Bitcoin was a dollar, and I bought it at a dollar, and I sold it for $30, and I patted myself on the back so hard, about how good. Obviously, now I'm kicking myself, but I got a master's degree partially funded out of my out of my Bitcoin proceeds. So, and I did a thesis on Bitcoin, an econometrics thesis, which I would be terrified to revisit now and see what it actually says. I'm sure I like spelled Bitcoin with two words or something, but but yeah, what drew me into the space was just I mean I think I was interested in um, like this new tech, like the decentralization ethic has always appealed to me a little bit. And so that caught my eye. But what really grabbed me, I mean, I was just kind of like a fellow traveler until CryptoKitties. And the NFT thing is what really grabbed me and hooked me and demanded that I get involved.
Okay, so CryptoKitties is when you first got into NFTs.
I wasn't cool enough for CryptoPunks. Few were, but yeah, it was so
Few
December
were.
2017. Yeah.
So when you first heard about CryptoKitties and you started learning about NFTs, this was still very early days in the big scheme of things. How did you go about wrapping your mind around it? Because even in the last 6 months, as NFTs have really blown up and gotten into the mainstream, we've seen, like so much rhetoric around NFTs and people trying to understand what NFTs are, why is there value behind basically a GIF or an image that I can download from my computer? A lot of these questions. And so, this was years ago that you got exposed to NFTs. How did you go about wrapping your mind around like what is this concept and why is this valuable?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were two things that were probably on my mind at first. I mean, one thing, there's the sense that like we're so used to uniqueness in the regular world that something will trace a sort of unique history so that if somebody gives you something, you have that specific thing. And that doesn't exist in the digital space. Uh, CryptoKitties is the thing that sort of triggered that for me. You started to think like, okay, well, if somebody gifted that, this will always be the item they gifted. And you can't really say that about anything else digital. But to sort of prove it to myself, the analogy that really wound up sticking, which I think everybody thinks is kind of weird, but I this is the analogy that worked for me, so I might as well tell you, is the rules of basketball, which I think sold for I think $8 million or something like that. And the reason that analogy was so interesting to me is this guy wrote it in a gym in 1908 or 1890 or something. His name's James Naismith, but he wrote it on a typewriter. And the typewritten pages, which are just the rules of basketball that got posted, that is what sold for $2 million or $3 million. And so this idea that people would value this unique object that was actually just a digitally intermediated object, not digitally because it's a typewriter, but you know what I mean? Like it's not like his handwriting, it's not like his beautiful sketch. It's just it could have been anybody who typed it. It's just that people knew it was him. And so when I found that example, that's what really kind of grabbed me and especially plugged me more into the like memorabilia of knowledge piece.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. And I'm also curious because, especially when I talk to people who, do have a lot of writing out there, do a lot of research, and do a lot of thinking in this space, you're one of my go to sources to learn about the space. But for you, like, who are your go to sources for learning in the space?
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, Matt G. Condon is somebody who has informed, he's one of the many Matts on Twitter. He's a friend of mine, and he taught me a lot about NFTs from the beginning. But I would say in terms of art, especially, like he has really good taste, and pretty most of the stuff. If you ask me what I really like in the NFT space, I probably saw it on his Twitter. Like that's a pretty good chance. I will say at the time, like in 2018, everything was very medium focused. That's how you learned. But uh, and now, I mean, Twitter is kind of the go-to and who you follow. But really good, obviously. Um, and uh, like I will say, most of the time, to my great shame, aside from like very mainstream sources and a couple of skeptics who I like follow because they're skeptical, I mostly kind of just get channeled through like people linking me stuff on Slack and seeing something good on Twitter and whatnot.
That's totally fair. That's pretty much how I get most of my information too. So I think that's just the age that we live in today. And so, obviously NFTs are sort of your thing. You're one of the OGs in the NFT space. Before we dive deeper into that, maybe let's just take a step back and explain what NFTs are to somebody who's listening and maybe still isn't, entirely sure of what it is. How would you explain NFTs to a newbie?
Yeah, well, so I really like this analogy with dollars. So everybody knows what it's like to go into a bar or a small business or something like that and see that somebody has posted a dollar bill and framed it on the wall, and it's the first dollar bill that they ever sold, right? Like the first dollar that the business ever made. And now you imagine calling a bank and saying, if it was a credit card transaction that was your first transaction, like, hey, that first dollar out of that transaction was really important. Will you set it aside? In the digital space, there's no notion of what that dollar would be. Like, even if you got a banker to help you out and really wanted to find this dollar for you, it just doesn't exist. It's a count in a database. And so NFTs bring this notion of what a single dollar could be, a unique object that we might like to put all of our sort of human values around. This was the first dollar that my business got, or this was the something that, my grandmother gave me, or my mom gave me in the digital space. And so that concept of digital uniqueness and digital scarcity is the right way to think about it, in the same way that information transfer is the right way to think about the internet. And you can go deeper in terms of exploring like what is the tech and what does it look like on chain. But I really think the best way to talk about it, in the same way that when you say what is the internet, somebody says, well, the internet has to do with the ability to send information. What are NFTs? NFTs are about this scarcity and uniqueness with digital objects that allow you to sort of interact with them the same way we're used to interacting with real objects in the real world.
So it's interesting that you use the dollar bill as your explanation for what an NFT is, because people often, use fiat currency as an example of fungibility, and then, artwork as an example of non-fungibility. So, and this is something that, you and I have talked about before, and that you wrote about in your theory of fungibility paper, is, like when you think about fungibility and non-fungibility, which, NFT, non-fungible token, is it really like a black and white, like this is either fungible or non-fungible, or is there a spectrum? And then are things inherently fungible or non-fungible, or somewhere part of that spectrum, or is it, a value that humans prescribe onto that thing?
Yeah, those are both really deep questions. I'll try to do them justice. So it's definitely a spectrum, right? Like if you tried to think of something that's maximally fungible, maximally interchangeable, that doesn't really make sense. And when you try to think of something that's maximally non-fungible, maximally unique, that doesn't really make sense. I mean, maybe you could imagine the universe itself is maximally non-fungible or something. Like there's some philosophy, but there's definitely a spectrum. There are things that tend to be treated as more unique, right? Like a painting or something like that. And there are things that tend to be treated as more naturally kind of like interchangeable. So to your point, dollars, right? Like I like that dollar example so much because it calls to mind the fact that like a dollar bill is almost always fungible to you. When you're in the gas station buying a Gatorade, it's the same dollar bill. You don't care, right? It just has the potential to be non-fungible. And I think that's probably closer to the way we should think about non-fungibility in the digital space as well, as something that doesn't confer value necessarily by itself. It just allows the potential for value, this sort of like this scarcity, right? Similarly, I mean, one thing I like to go back to is when I first learned about NFTs, I wanted to buy the pizza Bitcoin. I was like, or, I think there were probably 10,000 of them, or however many there were. I wanted to buy one of the pizza Bitcoins. And so I looked really hard to figure it out. And because of the way Bitcoin itself is actually architected, you can't really do that. There's no notion of it in the digital space either. And so, yeah, creating something where you could sort of hang that pizza Bitcoin or that first Bitcoin in the digital space is the same kind of thing. Did I miss a part of that question? I think I might have.
No, I think that's good. But something else that I would like you to touch upon is your water analogy that you wrote in one of your papers as well. I think that's really interesting too.
Oh yeah, well thank you. So I wrote this piece that was really kind of a response to some engineer friends I have, like Web3 engineer friends I have, who are skeptical about NFTs. And I think it's hard if you're an engineer because you can be too close to the code. Uh, if somebody tells you that they really value this, t-shirt they got, you know, from a concert they went to with their dad or something, right? Somebody who's way too close to that t-shirt and can only see it as like a collection of atoms that are interchangeable with other atoms, it would feel like, what are you talking about, right? Like these atoms are the same atoms, don't you understand? And of course that's true, right? Like at some level, there's these things are kind of like fungible as far as we can tell. And I think engineers in the digital space felt the same about NFTs because it's like, I can just see it's just this string of letters or the string of hacks. So the water analogy was supposed to just sort of provide a context for remembering how weird our human conceptions of like a thing is. There was this brilliant cognitive psychologist named B.C. Malt who who asked people what they thought water was, and then and also to name some things that weren't water. And so, what's a good example of something that isn't water? Tea, but it's kind of water-like. And what's another example? Lemonade, right? Like those are all not water. But then she'd say, how much H2O do they have? And they'd say, like, I don't know, probably like 99%, which is true. And then what's an example of something that is water? Well, they'd say like swamp water, river water, right? Dishwater. Well, how much H2O is in that? They'd say like, I don't know, 70%. And so you think the answer to what is water is going to be H2O in the same way that what is an NFT is going to be this string of hex that sits on a blockchain, right? Um, and when you're in that mode, it can seem weird that people have these weird distinctions, such that if I just dip a tea bag suddenly into this water, it becomes tea, even though it's changed that much. In the same way that if an artist says this string of hex is the art or part of the art inseparably, it can just become that. The point was effectively that that's not that weird. We're used to that in the real world all the time, right? Like I can dip a tea bag in the Hudson River, and it doesn't become tea. Lipton can pollute the Hudson River such that the tea content of the Hudson is the same as the tea in my cup. It's still not tea, right? And so this notion that um, the intent really matters a lot in terms of how we class something as water or not water, art, non-art, original scientific paper, non-original authentic scientific paper, maybe.
Yeah, and so is it your position to almost say, maybe we understand NFTs inherently more so than we think we do, and we're sort of just like overthinking it or fighting that or just trying to, argue with ourselves on this when inherently we do understand the value of NFTs?
I think absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot. It's interesting to talk about and it's interesting to experiment with. And I love the artists who are pushing the boundaries of like uh, what NFT art could be. And I applaud all that stuff. But at the same time, I do think pretty much everybody gets it. When they have an NFT in their wallet and you have them send it to somebody else or send it to the burn address, my experience is they understand it pretty innately, that it starts to feel like a thing. Like, oh, I can send this to the burn address and nobody will ever own it again. That feels a lot like a thing that you destroyed, right? I can transfer this to you and I'll never own it again and I won't have the rights to, like it just feels like a minimum viable thingness that is pretty natural and intuitive when people experience NFTs and don't overthink them. So yeah, I would be inclined to agree that your experience is probably the best guide. And I think in economics anyway, we're used to thinking that, well, if somebody paid $68 million for something, they're probably valuing it. And given the amount of money that's been paid for NFTs, I mean, at first pass, you just go, there's something people like about it, right? They didn't pay for it as a JPEG, they paid for it as an NFT. There's something to this. And I find that just fascinating. That you make a world computer that has these characteristics that Ethereum has, and the objects on it start to get treated kind of like real world objects. I mean, I find that fascinating and amazing and really cool.
100%. Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. And so, having been in the space in the last few years, or it's probably been three or 4 years now since CryptoKitties came out, how have you seen NFTs evolve? And I think this will be a good transition into talking about the science NFTs that you're working on now.
I mean, so I got in right as in some sense ERC or NFTs were defined, which was the ERC 721 specification. I think that actually happened a little after I played with CryptoKitties. If I remember the timing right, I have to look again. Um, and so a lot of the evolution, there's standards that have changed it a little bit, but 721, that initial standard has remained pretty constant. I think there has been a lot more thinking about ways to kind of like marry what the NFT is supposed to represent in some sense to the on-chain. I'm a big fan of. So I think Zora has done some really interesting work on this, and one of the things that I think is now being pretty regularly considered and thought about is both where you keep the sort of visual data, which is not going to be on a blockchain because it's too expensive, like making sure that's on IPFS or Arweave or something that's kind of decentralized, so that the image stays there. That's been a newer innovation, and then maybe trying to make the on-chain representation a hash or a signed hash of the contents. I think enforcing that as more of a standard and making that more normative is a thing. Those two things are really positive directions, but also obviously there's just been this tremendous explosion in creative work around it. I mean, we could talk about all the sorts of cool generative art projects and things like that that are, I mean, that stuff's all amazing.
Yeah, and then another newer application of it is science NFTs, and that's what you're working on with Planck. And so, tell us a little bit more about Planck, what it is. You've been working on it for a couple of years, but it's really just blown up in the last few months, or maybe I just heard about
Yeah.
it in the last
No, no,
few
no.
months, and I think okay.
No, no, it's blown up in the last few months. So it started in 2018. I mean, I started working on Planck effectively after I was in my PhD working on innovation and incentives for innovation, and then learning about CryptoKitties and thinking about this weird kind of memorabilia way that scientists used to have to fund their work. Like Galileo was trying to convince people that it was interesting to study a frictionless plane or like the motion of a planet, and people were like, "You should study like how we can shoot this cannon better, buddy." And so he had to he had to get creative and name stars after the Medici family, and right, like there's this aspect of memorabilia and collectibles that's connected a little bit to science. And so I started working on it. I wrote an essay that was um, pretty well received. I was lucky enough to get some appreciation out of it, and it was canonized in the A16Z NFT canon, which is really cool. That was on science NFTs. Um, but then, science NFTs were never really going to be a thing before art NFTs, and so there was there was a like biding our time and waiting for the moment to launch the coolest science NFT that went on in 2019 and 2020. And I did some work for Dapper and some other companies in the meantime to sort of like wait. And then when it happened in 2021, as we remember, so we were ready. We had conducted a pretty cool study that we released and sold as a science NFT. And then there was a decent amount of other backlog and things that had been planned for this moment that suddenly rolled out really, really quickly. And we were talking about this a little earlier that, like, in some sense, there's a lot to discuss and a lot to cover about Planck, in part because it's a 2 year, there's portions of like a 2 year rollout plan that have been compressed into like 2 or 3 months, and a lot's come out pretty quickly. But that was our first thing, was the science NFT.
Yeah, okay. So let's talk a little bit more about this science NFT, and this is the one that you just sold for $24,000. So you were conducting research. What was the research that you were conducting for the study?
Yeah, so it's weird because so I'm a behavioral economist. I'm conducting research on something in a totally different field. And the connection is that it was about trying to identify like what kind of ideas could slip through the cracks under current incentives, right? Like demonstrating the way that NFTs might be able to reward things that the system couldn't have rewarded before felt like a really cool and novel thing. So looking for a good example of like a theory or a piece of knowledge or a piece of science that just had been forgotten, and happened upon this one from Seth Roberts, who is a Berkeley psychologist and kind of a rat researcher actually, that was around the idea that flavorless calories could reduce people's appetite. And when he released this, there was actually a decent amount of fanfare. He was a pretty serious thinker, even though he wasn't a nutritionist. And his statistics were a little weird. They were self experimentation for the most part. But at the same time, some really credible people like Andrew Gellman and Alex Tabarrok and Aaron Swartz, the co founder of Reddit, and Eliezer Yudkowsky and some other people took it pretty seriously. And they were like, there's something interesting here. We all can't wait until the clinical trials will obviously be done, because obesity kills 2 million people a year, or 2 million people a year. There's a lot of like personal hardship faced by people who can't control their appetite, but also just people want to be vegan and they're tempted by cheese pizza, right? Like there's this way that controlling your appetite could be a really powerful unlock. Somebody thinks they can do it. It's published in the New York Times, right? Like credible people are saying this should be studied. Just never happens. It's not patentable, right? Like you can't patent a flavorless calorie. And in fact, the researcher who is no longer with us was pretty. He was a pretty good scientist on this front. He did not try to say like, oh, it's this special oil that does it. He actually went and studied. Gosh, could I hold my nose and eat? Does that count as a flavorless calorie? According to him, turned out yeah. Like according to his data. So randomized control trial of it, crowdsourced it, and we had people buy olive oil and get randomized into conditions with a website that I built. And I programmed up an email protocol so that they'd be emailed to track their hunger and see whether the flavorless calorie condition was different substantially than the like flavored calorie condition. We ran the design by prominent statistician on the stats blog as well, and then collected those results, looked at them, and put a graph together. And that graph was the visual representation of the NFT.
Gotcha, gotcha. So what were the results?
Okay, so the results. I'm finishing up writing something on this right now, so it's on the brain. The results, I will say, in my opinion, look very good. And I will say that I think most anybody who's looking at it would say that it's more likely, having seen the results, that this theory is true than before having seen the results. But I do think it falls short of a full scientific finding because when you run a crowdsourced study, you can't control the number of people who sign up. Um, and this will take us into the scientific weeds. I'll let you guide me whether you want to circle back and have me detail this part. But I guess I'll just say that there's a thing you try to do before you run a study where you figure out how many people you want. And I wanted this many people, like 800 people. And I got 200 people, well, actually 150 people who stayed on and did it, which I find remarkable. I mean, they had to buy olive oil and drink it, like that's, and do it for 5 days and like respond to my annoying emails 3 times a day for this random theory they just heard about. And so I am eternally grateful to them. At the same time, I knew go as soon as the study was run, like we're not going to have what's called the statistical power to get a full result. So we have a statistically significant result. I ran it by a couple of statisticians who took a look. I mean, I think everybody who's seen the results agree that it ranges from like not bad to like, oh, this is actually pretty promising. And more importantly, we're taking the money that the NFT sold for, the 24,000, and we're running like a full scale replication that will ensure we get the power available to really test it. And that'll happen this summer.
Got it. And so was that sort of the goal from the start is like, let me mint this as an NFT, sell it for, however much I can so that I can conduct a full blown study? And is that the model that you hope to replicate in the future with, more science NFTs that come out of Planck?
Yes, exactly right. Because at the end of the day, even though this one didn't get the power, even if we hadn't got the power, I think it, or if we had gotten it, I think it would be the case that it would still just feel a little bit weird, right? It's nice to have this research conducted by an independent lab, and so modeling this way to bridge like citizen science or perspective science in the direction of real science, so that even if it does fall a little short for whatever reason, you have this ability to sell the NFT and then generate the thing that can actually close the gap and bring it to like a full scientific result, or reject it, right, as pseudoscience, which of course we certainly want to do that too, right? Like it's real science, so we want to make sure if it's false, we falsify it. But yeah, that path of you sell the NFT of either the prospective study or the earlier preliminary study, and that can fund the connection to the research. And then that early NFT that the person bought can grow in value if the research is validated. Because, I mean, if this thing changes the world, I would expect the person who owns the NFT that to have more value to them, at least personally. I mean, it's a cool thing, right? Like it's proof they rewarded this research that really like could change things quite a bit. I mean, Aaron Swartz called it like a future without obesity or something like that. And, he just basically imagined it was going to be this crazy transformative thing. That goes on. Yeah, I would think this NFT would mean a lot.
Yeah, very cool. And so who ended up buying your NFT? Was it like an institution or was it just a person that was like, I really want to know the results of this question?
Yeah, we actually got a decent number of bids, and I knew a few of the people who were bidding, and so a few of them who they got some texts from me like, "You better not win this." But the person who won, I did not know him. I talked to him the day after, though. His name is Paul Kohlhaas, and he's working on a really cool project himself on NFTs that sort of like hold intellectual property around health. So like NFTs that actually hold patents, real patents, like legally enforced patents. Um, and it was a thrill to like talk to him. It was a great gift that he thought this was cool. I guess it's kind of no surprise that he would think it was cool because he was working at least adjacent enough. And then we hit it off great, and I'm a big fan of his, and I feel like it's mutual. And at any rate, yeah, I really like his stuff, and it was cool to meet him.
Yeah, very cool. And then when you minted this and put it on the market to sell it as an NFT, what were your expectations? Did you think it would sell for, it was 24,000 like in your
That
ballpark
was
of like I
outside.
think it was
I didn't
outside.
think that was
Okay.
going to happen. Yeah, yeah, that was better than I thought. I mean, my hope was that it would be a number enough that it could make a little bit of a splash. So I was hoping for at least a few hundred or something, where it would be like, oh, that's interesting. If it's like we sold the first science NFT for $2, I feel like it's a little less exciting. I would have still been proud. I mean, it's a cool thing, I think, to have done it, but it was nice that the number is enough to actually start to prove out and probably fund a replication. I mean, the full ideal lab replication that we wanted to do in the design, which has like we wanted to test people's ghrelin hormones, and there's a way to really, really do this and figure out what the mechanism is. That's gonna be well outside the bounds of 24,000, but that will get us enough to do a pretty good replication, and so that's beyond the expectations and ultimately our wildest dreams, I think.
That's awesome. And so how far along are you with conducting the research, the fuller research on this study?
So validated what the two options for labs would be. And what we have going on now is we're going to do a design competition because, again, I'm not an expert in this. I designed the test to the best of my ability. I mean, I've run a lot of experiments, but I'm not a nutritionist. And so I think the design was fine, but we want to make sure that if this test hasn't been run for 15 years of people clamoring for it. So if we have a chance to do it, we want to make sure we do it as make sure it's as well specified as we can. So there's a design competition which should be rolling out soon. I had to wait on judge timing a little bit and get a few things arranged, but we have two really cool, amazing judges who will be judging the design, and that's the design we'll be rolling with and submitting to the labs. And hopefully we get something that's pretty cool and surprising. But worst case, I mean, it will just be an improvement on the original design, and that's something that I think will run pretty quick.
Yeah, and then once you have the results on this full-blown study, are you going to publish that again as minted as an NFT and sell that? Is that the
Indeed.
idea? Okay.
Indeed, yes, and in fact, that's doing something kind of cool. That is the next thing that Planck's rolling out. Actually, where that money goes is is to a prize, which I think will be kind of a cool thing. So the original, I think I mentioned I'm clearing like 2 years of backlog. The original NFT paper we wrote was called Post Venture Capital and the Crypto Nobel Prize, and it was supposed to be about this idea that NFTs could have innate value, but also that prizes could be NFTs as well, and prizes could be exchanged for NFTs. So we're taking the money for, which will hopefully be non-trivial. I mean, you never know, but at least it'll be something, and that will go to seed fund a prize. And these prizes are kind of neat. They the prize design not only goes to reward new innovations in science, particularly things that were sort of like we're looking for things that were forgotten or left behind, like studies, and that are what the prize is going to be designed to reward. We have some really cool judges for that as well. Um, and the cool thing about the prize design is that it's designed to sort of be self-perpetuating, such that the prize funds get topped up by the NFTs that you exchange the prizes for over time. So the hope is that you get this kind of like, I don't know, auto poetic is the $10 word. I think the better word is like self-sustaining. And that's we're seeding what's hopefully this like self-sustaining prize fund that will go to award this stuff in the future.
Gotcha, gotcha. Okay, so explain to me a little bit more how Planck fits into all of this. Is Planck the platform where people can mint their NFTs, or is it sort of just like the breeding ground for this community of scientists who want to run these experiments? Or tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so when we decided to launch, and go live in 2021, I think one of the real guiding things was I didn't want to duplicate efforts with anybody. I wanted everything to feel very like collaborative to the furthest extent possible. And so our goal for the year has been to try and use tech to the furthest extent we can rather than reinvent any wheel. So we used OpenSea as a platform at first. We used Mirror as a platform for a secondary NFT sale. There's a zero knowledge proof protocol that we used so we could have some statisticians query the results. And we did that with an existing company called Alio. who they were really good to work with. And so I think what's going to happen, to your point, uh, is Planck will probably eventually have to be a protocol in the sense that there are parts of our design that are far enough away from what exists now that we're going to have to start to build the stuff ourselves. But then let's do as many things as we can with the tech that already exists, because I mean it's just amazing what people have built in the NFT space over the last year or two, and it would be a shame to just try, like I'm so thrilled with what Devin's done with OpenSea and what Dennis has done with Mirror. Like the opportunity to like play with that tooling um, is like fascinating and amazing. So we've tried to do that as much as possible.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And then another question that people have with NFTs, and I think this is maybe an even bigger question with science NFTs, is how does IP apply to that? So normally, if you conduct a scientific research, you publish a paper, you might want to patent whatever discovery that you've made. And so with the science NFTs, I know you've talked about something with like an alt IP system.
Yeah,
And okay, so can you talk a little bit more about that, like how that's similar to or different from our traditional IP system?
yeah. So I call Planck sort of an alt IP system. That's it. The role of it is kind of similar to the role that IP plays, but it's explicitly alt because it's not trying to use any governmental mechanisms of enforcement. So, right, like the way patents work are the government gives you a legally enforced right to excludability, such that if anybody uses the thing that you patented, you get to sue them, right? So they're excluded from use. Um, Planck isn't involved in patents that are in working in that sense. And there is a company, Paul, actually, who I just mentioned. He's doing something that does, and I mean, I think there's definitely that's a very cool thing and a very cool use case. But you think about what a patent is supposed to do. What a patent is ultimately supposed to do, you go back to the early history, it's attempting to just ensure that people who did high fixed cost innovations, right, like these things that take a long time, but then once you reveal them to somebody, right, like it's free to copy, this thing that you see on the internet all the time. Early innovations, like somebody would invent the marine chronometer, like this incredible navigational tool that would allow ships to sail. But then, well, once you show somebody a marine chronometer, they can just take it apart and figure out how you did it. So yeah, it took you 5 years, but now you have like 1,000 competitors. And so the original patent idea was just to make sure that the person who did the original thing is rewarded sufficiently that they could do it again. And so Planck is attempting to be a system that can do that, right? And so you can see that, like, even to take the first example, Seth Roberts spent a lot of time on this. We spent a decent amount of time, nowhere near the amount he did, right? But trying to run the replication. Whatever process eventually generates this as a finding, if it is indeed a finding, the finding will just be there, right? Like there's no patentable enforcement of it. An olive oil company can start tomorrow and start highlighting this study and saying this proves that you should be drinking extra light olive oil and you'll lose weight or something like that, right? And and there's no defensibility for another, for the person who necessarily like did the work, nor should there be. I mean, I can't run an olive oil company. I'm sure Seth couldn't either, right? And so you actually want to enable this sort of division of labor, which I think is what patents were all about. Right? This ability for somebody who invented the marine chronometer to open it up so people could like use it, improve on it, and so on, right? While also having it protected. Planck's trying to effectively do the same thing with NFTs through these two channels. Channel one is just this connection with the future that memorabilia value can give you, right? To sell the NFT to somebody who might see the potential in it in the future means that even if this gets spread and changes the world through companies that don't care at all about what we do, the idea will at least matter and have sort of anti-rival property. And the person who funded and started the idea and sort of has the NFT will have a little extra because they own it. And then secondly, there's this piece called the split stream, which is designed to flow value back toward things that aren't naturally appreciated by the market. And those two things in concert are supposed to replicate some of the things that patents are supposed to solve around rewarding these high fixed cost knowledge generation sort of goods.
For sure. Very, very interesting stuff. And so, zooming out of this a little bit, how do you think allowing scientists to mint their scientific studies as NFTs is going to, further scientific research, or what is this going to do for like the broader, science field in general?
Yeah, so I feel really positively about this. I guess, as you can imagine, in economics, we think we know a couple of things, not that many things. One thing we know, we think, is that ideas are the only source of wealth in the world, right? Like that can sound a little weird because you think of wealth as being money, but wealth in terms of growth is just new ideas, what Paul Romer calls new recipes, new ways of like organizing matter in the world such that, we used to be traveling this way by horse, become more efficient, right? Those are ideas. We also think that ideas are this kind of ultimate public good, meaning ideas are the sorts of things where if you've encoded them well, if you've expressed them well, if you've explained them to somebody, they're just owned by everybody immediately, right? And you can't exclude other people from them once you've communicated it. And we know that public goods are underfunded and under provisioned. So if that's the case, those two things together give you a pretty either terrible story or a very promising story about what you can do if you change these incentives by, a millionth of a percent. Because it tells you ideas are pretty much all we have to improve the world over time. And we are absolutely terrible at rewarding encoded ideas, right? And if we think incentives matter, which that's the other sort of core principle of economics, then you just stack those things together. We're terrible at rewarding incentives or incentivizing innovation and knowledge sharing. Incentives matter, thus people are not sharing as much knowledge or generating as much knowledge as they should be. And this knowledge is what generates growth. We're just incredibly far away from the optimum, right? Like there is potentially a lot of wealth, idea generation, sharing, and so on that could and should be generated if the incentives were different. And if we can get even a little bit there, like a little bit closer to that, that will be this big, cool, world-changing thing. And so if scientists are able to fund things that otherwise wouldn't have been able to be funded, and other scientists are able to look over and go, oh, I could actually kind of tinker around with this and generate maybe something kind of cool, and that research turns into something cool, and they do this because they see the NFT sale and they otherwise wouldn't have, yeah, I think that could be really amazing.
Super cool. And so, in your perfect world, where will we be with NFTs in, let's say, 10 years?
I think in my perfect world, NFTs are normalized. They're maybe called NFTs, maybe not. It maybe starts to feel weird for things to be fungible online more than non-fungible. Just because I think as the digital space becomes more normalized and people kind of lose their biases that are like, oh, you're weird for looking at art on your phone. You should look out on a wall. It's like we're more and more in the digital space, right? So the idea that the digital space will become reflective of our natural human impulses and desires and the sorts of things that we really love and value, right? Like around what's this is a $10 phrase, but like the biographical indexicality is what it's called when you look at like these people who study collectibles. Like, why do people collect? Why do they treasure I keep saying a scarf or a teacup or whatever it is? It's because these objects provide a biographical index to events that really have a lot of meaning for us. Like, this is a beautiful human thing that we are really used to in life, and having that in the digital space is, to me, feels like so natural and so desirable that I really expect that to become more of the norm, insofar as it can be the norm. I mean, it remains to be understood like what you need to meet that sort of like threshold for a minimally viable NFT. But yeah, that would be my dream.
Awesome. Yeah, I certainly hope that we'll be there in 10 years too. I would love to see that as well. So switching gears a little bit, something else I want to talk to you about is your PhD in behavioral economics and how that ties into Web3 and DAOs in particular. And so, maybe a good place to start is, what is behavioral economics? What do you actually study?
Yeah. So behavioral economics is a subfield of economics that was designed at. It started with sort of poking at some of the assumptions of rationality in economics in the 80s. Infamously, economics has this assumption of like perfectly rational, selfish agents. And behavioral economists started to say like, well, people aren't always that rational and people aren't always selfish. And we can design some cool experiments that demonstrate the ways in which people will predictively and repeatedly violate the sort of core tenets. So that's behavioral econ. It tends to be really an experimental discipline for the most part, and I tended to run and design a lot of experiments. And I particularly worked in this area of trust and division of labor, like the ways that people naturally like cooperated and interacted in tasks, and the way that like they liked to work with people that they trusted or they'd worked with previously, and so on. So that was my particular field. But behavioral economics is typically like other, what are called other regarding preferences, and then like kind of biases and irrationalities.
Right. And so it's super interesting how you've been able to tie that into crypto because there are a lot of questions about how people work together, what incentivizes people, and all of these things, especially in the realm of DAOs. But what are some things that you've studied, I guess, in the crypto space that you can really apply behavioral economics to?
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, NFTs are an interesting example, weirdly. One of the most famous behavioral economics experiments is what sometimes just called the mug study. Nobel laureate Richard Thaler and co-authors did a study where they gave students these mugs, and then they tried to buy them back from the students effectively, and they recorded all the values, right? And the values were like $5 a mug. And then with a different class that was also really large, so you can sort of expect they're comparable, they just auctioned off the mugs in the first place. So both of these model and the values were much lower, right? It's like $2 a mug or $3 a mug or something like that, right? So what you get is the sense that once the mug is owned, once it becomes part of your story, it's valued differently. So that study forms the basis of what's called prospect theory and the endowment effect, like this Nobel Prize winning research. But if you think about it, there's a way in which that mug study is about non fungibility, about the way that this mug that economists think should be perfectly fungible with another mug is made different because of its unique history. And that unique history is I own this mug, right? Therefore, it's valued differently, right? And that's a neat thing to think about in the NFT context. But beyond that, I mean, organizations and cooperation and the ways that like monetary incentives get complicated and attention is scarce and social incentives can kind of be crowded out by monetary incentives and all these fun behavioral economics things really come to a head a lot in the way that DAOs are obviously a big example of a place where you think about it a lot. And I mean, public goods in general, which is something that there's a lot of talk and a lot of discussion in this space around solving. There is work done on sort of like the experimental economics and behavioral economics of public goods. So I use it pretty much in literally everything I do in crypto on some level or another. But I think the mug study is like the one that probably helped me understand why NFTs might not be that weird. And the rest of it is just like when you do behavioral econ experiments, what you're really doing is you're sitting people at a computer and you're giving them a very abstract incentive game. You're not telling them, you're not saying like, hey, you're going to play a banker and you're going to play a bank teller and you're going to play it. Like, you're just giving them, um, you have $15, you have $10, here's what you can send. You don't give them a story. You see how people interact over this very abstract set of incentives. And I do think that in my work at Block Science, doing some incentive design, and obviously a lot of my work at Planck, I do think that's also just been helpful. The way that when you interact with smart contracts and you interact with these incentive structures and mechanism designs that are supposed to scale up really big, like you see in blockchains, a lot of that is going to present to people as this person gets this amount of money, this person gets this amount of money, and the context in which that changes can, or that, the context that affects that can vary a lot. So it's nice to have these kind of like intuitions and experiments to fall back on.
Yeah, so I want to dig a little bit deeper into public goods because you've brought it up a few times already, and you wrote this article, Public Goods Problems versus Coordination Problems, which I think you co-wrote with Scott Moore from Gitcoin, who we had on
Yeah,
the
and Michael
podcast
Zargo.
recently. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, great. So I'm going to ask you this, same questions I asked him, but I guess before we do that, why don't you just give us a little background on what is the public goods problem, what is a coordination problem, what's the difference between the two, or how are they similar?
Yeah, so there's this interesting relationship between public goods and coordination problems. Especially, you see it a lot in like Web3 and the space where people will talk about them in these ways that sort of confuse the two things. And in experimental economics, they're different and they're different types of games. So public goods games are the sorts of games where there is an optimal solution that would make everybody in the game better off, and you just can't quite get there. And that's what a public good problem feels like. And to me, that's the important part is when you play these games and when you interact with these in these public goods problems, they have a feeling. They have a feeling where you see the way you could make it better off. Um, and you also will just find as you try to do it, you can't get there. So the analogy we use in the paper is everybody's probably lived with like some slobby roommates at some point, and sometimes it'll be like, gosh, wouldn't we all just be better off? Everybody in the house wants clean dishes, right? That's a public goods problem because we can see the state of the world, which is better for all of us, right? And we could all just get there if we would all just wash the dishes. And then maybe someday you're like, let's all do it. Today we're going to do it. We're all going to clean up, and the dishes are going to be clean, and we're going to feel so good about it that we never let the dishes, get dirty and fill up the sink again. Um, and of course, what happens typically is that, yeah, a week or two later, you just let the dishes start filling up again. And that to me is the best way to sort of explain the difference between a public goods problem and a coordination problem. When you think you can get to the optimum and you try to get everybody there, but you can't stay there, that's a public goods kind of feeling, right? And that's the frustration of somebody who thinks they're in a coordination game. Coordination game being one where if you just got people to that state, they'd stay there. Like if you just made the dishes clean one time, people would clean them forever. That's a coordination game. Public goods game, if you clean everything up, it'll just get dirty again. And the interplay between those two, I find it's fascinating and complex and in some sense kind of undecidable, but those are the two concepts and how they're different.
So, what's the solution to the public goods problem?
So weirdly, and here's the kind of catch, there is no such thing as a solution to a public goods problem. As defined, public goods problems cannot be solved. And that sounds like a sort of pedantic, annoying, like game theory approach. And in some sense it is, right? But the real trick is it's a creative act to solve what we call a public goods problem. And the creative act is to suddenly see the way that the public goods problem is actually a coordination problem, right? That there is a solution that exists. So I'm not sure if we want to stack analogies on analogies, but the other one we used is standing up at a concert, which has this similar sort of thing, right? So if you're sitting down at a concert and enjoying it, somebody stands up 2 rows in front of you, you have to stand to see. If everybody suddenly stands, their view isn't any better off than it was before, right? But now you're stuck here because if the person 3 rows in front of you sits, it doesn't change anything. Your view is still bad, right? And so there's this stickiness in the bad equilibrium. And so let's say everybody wishes they could be sitting. How do you get everybody there? Well, you can't just do it, right? Like you can't just sit. And so how do we reimagine the situation? Well, I don't know. If you have a bullhorn, you could maybe yell at everybody, right? But there's also, I think, Andy, who of course we both know and you had on the podcast, and who's excellent at Kernel. He had this suggestion that, well, why don't you just try to make everybody dance? Like, why don't you make them enjoy standing up? Totally brilliant solution, right? Like, it's just another way of reimagining what seemed like a public goods problem where we had to get here and coordinate everybody there as a coordination problem where this is now the socially optimal equilibrium, right? And so these creative solutions actually wind up being the way. The only reason I'm being a little careful in my language is if any of my old game theory teachers are listening to this, they're going to go, there's no such thing as transforming a game from a public goods problem to a coordination problem. That's correct. Like the game is what it is, right? And the real way to think about solving it is to think that we are fooled into thinking that public goods problems are in fact public goods problems, and they must be unmasked uh, and revealed as the coordination problems that they are. And hopefully there's no such thing as a public goods problem, because a public goods problem are terrible. We don't want them to exist, right? Like they're these unsolvable problems where we can't make ourselves better off.
Okay, so one application of this that I think about a lot in Web3 is with open source. Everything is open source in Web3, whether it's code, whatever the case may be, research, anything. And so when we're talking about, open source everything, I think we face this problem of free riders where, some people may not contribute their share of it. And yes, it's like in a perfect world, everybody would just contribute all of their knowledge. And then, the whole world would be a much better place. It'd be full of knowledge. It would be like 2 heads is better than 1, but, however many billion heads is better than 1. But that's never going to be the case because you're always going to get people who don't want to contribute and just want to take out. So how do we solve this problem? Or how would you frame this? Is this a public goods problem, or how would you frame this?
That's definitely the right way to think about it, right? Like the analogy to the dishes people, those are the people who don't individually wash their own dishes, right? Those are the free riders in that analogy. And so yes, with like open source software and with knowledge sharing and so on, the problem is there's always a strategic advantage to withholding. Like in terms of monetary incentives, that is always as constructed an advantage. So what do you do to solve the problem? I think there are these cool, like, creative solutions. Obviously, Gitcoin has a really cool one that they've implemented with quadratic funding, which is, you know, there's a lot to explain about it, right? Like, one of the things is it's a very efficient way of trying to, like, get people to reveal their preferences and express their preferences in a way that doesn't just depend a lot on their wealth. And so that's a cool way of building and rewarding public goods that people want. Um, but in terms of knowledge sharing and rewarding things that have already been put out there, that's kind of a different problem, in some ways, a backward looking problem. And weirdly, in some ways, it's actually kind of like a problem that has to be solved by some people before you can even do quadratic funding, because you have to make a quadratic funding proposal, which is in some sense sharing the knowledge. So if the knowledge is itself a public good, then it's never actually clear why the person who made the proposal is the one who should receive the quadratic funds. Um, because why shouldn't it go to the person who can build it the best? Those two people shouldn't be the same. And so, I mean, for the things that are funded, I mean, there's a lot of things that go into that, where a lot of times the people who are suggesting it are the best ones to do it, or there's this sense of, like, reciprocity and the reward. And so the system works, but really analyzing, like, how the system works and what it sort of depends on, like these norms around, well, the person who should share it should get rewarded because they shared the proposal. That's kind of a cool and interesting thing to poke at and recognize is actually not, it's not literally irrational, but if you tried to look at it in terms of, like, the very dry economic incentives, it is kind of irrational. It's like, well, no, we should take this idea and we should instead give the funding to the person who can execute it. And if that's not you, then you shouldn't get anything. So there is this weird, like, knowledge sharing problem that even exists at the root of that as well. That is, I think, in fact solved, but it's very interesting to just think about the way that it is solved.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask you the same question I asked about NFTs. In your perfect world, how would, open source work with, obviously, like, being realistic too. It's not it's not like a totally utopian world where everybody just willingly contributes everything that they can and, everything's perfect. But in your perfect world, what would be the best solution to the public goods problem as we move forward in building Web3 and moving everything towards an open source environment?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that public goods problems are going to have to be probably solved, like, by application or domain by domain. But for knowledge sharing, which is the one that's near and dear to me and close to my heart, I mean, I think the best solution, and in some ways the one of the only solutions that you can really work it with, is to try and commit to solving it backwards. Like, there's two ways to look at it, right? One is you try to say, we're going to, like, algorithmically bounty some knowledge sharing, right? And we're going to have some way to determine what that is, right? Like, what the best possible thing is. And I think that can work, and it does work, but it relies on people expecting or knowing what they want. If you would have asked people what they wanted in 1900, they would have said a faster horse rather than a car or something like that, right? And so there is this way that forward-looking bounties have a limitation, and that limitation is, like, human expectation. And for things that are really transformative, it's often just really hard to reward that stuff by guessing at it, right? You can't say, I want the theory of relativity to exist because one day I'll have GPS on my phone. That happens to be true, but you can't understand what GPS is and how the theory of relativity. Einstein can't tell you probably that GPS is going to exist if you get the theory of relativity. And so design is around trying to work backwards from that and trying to basically say, if we can connect this thing that we like a lot to this earlier thing, let's try and make sure that a little bit of the value flows. And that commitment over time can allow more people to, like, share, and maybe some entrepreneurs, like idea entrepreneurs, to try and collect these early NFTs of ideas, which can maybe come one day to mean a lot more. So that's kind of like our approach. But I think both work in concert. And the one that's very forward looking, I think obviously, like, bounties are amazing for that. So.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. All right, well, thanks so much, Matt, for being here. I have to cut it off here. Be cognizant of your time. I feel like I could just talk to you for hours about all of this stuff. You have so many interesting articles out there. But so before you go, tell people where they can connect with you personally if they want to, chat with you more, or also, like, where they can go to find your writings, because you've got a ton of those, and all those are really good. And then tell people where they can go to learn more about Planck as well.
Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter at StevensonHMatt. If you are interested in trying to fund a self-sustaining prize, and you think that's a cool thing, you can get in touch. My DMs are open, and maybe we can talk. And then my website for Planck, which we're gonna push live by the time you hear this, I hope, is planck.com, but the L is a one, so P1ANCK.com. It's like Planck.
Cool, cool. We'll include that in the show notes too, so people can just click through to it easily if they get confused. Well, thanks so much, Matt, for coming on the podcast, for taking the time out of your day. I really appreciate it. We'll have to have you back for a part 2 of this because we have a lot more to talk about.
I would love that. Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome.
I love your podcast. You did the best interview, so thank you. This is great.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. Chat with you all later.
All right, take care.